The G7 leaders are meeting between June 13th and 15th in the Italian city of Fasano, which marks the 50th summit. The leaders of the United States, Japan, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the non-member states of the European Union attended the summit. As anticipated, the meeting centers on the Ukraine war, exploring ways to assist Ukraine, impose further sanctions on Russia, and to a lesser degree tackle issues related to migration and climate change. The summit invited not only the president of Ukraine, but also a sizable number of leaders from the global south, including Argentina, Brazil, and India, to improve relations in an area that is heavily influenced by China and Russia. The summit, instead of a show of unity and strength, demonstrated that the world is more polarized, closer to conflict, and how limited the electorally fragile leaders of the G7 are to be decisive. The G7 countries consist of democratic nations with robust rule-based systems. As a result of democratic processes, occasionally, some of the participants are in a delicate political position or new leadership that takes the country in a different direction than the prior year when they attend the summit. This year is markedly different, as all countries except for Italy are experiencing some form of political pressure. Most importantly, President Joe Biden has a historically low approval rating going into the 2024 elections in November, and cannot afford to make bold decisions that could further erode his electoral popularity. French President Emmanuel Macron called snap elections in France after his party was severely beaten by his political rival Marine Le Pen's party. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's ruling coalition was also badly beaten in the European elections, so he is also politically weakened. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is historically unpopular after a fundraising scandal by his party, and calls for a snap election in the fall by his opposition. United Kingdom Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called for elections for July 4, 2024, and his party is expected to lose as well. Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, is unpopular at home, and his ruling party is most likely to replace him as party head before the next elections in 2025. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, a European conservative, is the exception, and is widely popular in her country but has only been Prime Minister for 2 years. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who represents the EU at the G7 summit, is also in a delicate political position after the European Parliament elections, but as of now she's still viable because there is no other consensus candidate to replace her. Weak leaders are leading this year's G7 summit, and outside of Italy they could potentially lose their positions by the time of the 2024 G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro in November. This implies that the next summit in 2025 may reverse or significantly alter any agreements reached at this year's summit. With a largely embattled G7 leadership backdrop, the primary agenda item for the summit was to support Ukraine and punish Russia over the war. Japan signed a 10-year non-lethal aid agreement with Ukraine. The United States also signed a 10-year agreement with Ukraine that commits the US to providing weapons, including additional F-16s, ammunition, training, helping Ukraine grow its defense industry, and setting up intelligence sharing between the two nations. The agreement did not designate the level of support, but it did set expectations that the US president would work with Congress to establish the funding. The agreement also requires Ukraine to enact judicial and anti-corruption reforms as part of their commitments. Following the agreement's signing, President Biden clarified that US troops would not engage in combat in Ukraine, and he prohibited the use of US weapons for deep or offensive strikes into Russian territory, thereby establishing another red line. The agreement includes provisions for Ukraine to participate in joint military maneuvers with the US and its allies. This is most likely a consolation to Ukraine, as it is unlikely that Ukraine will be offered NATO membership at the NATO-Washington summit in July 2024. The US likely wants to provide Ukraine with a swift route to NATO membership, but given NATO's requirement for unanimous consent and the ongoing war, this is not feasible at this time. The best alternative to NATO membership is an invitation to participate in maneuvers and other exercises. The problem with the agreement is that President Biden will not submit it to the US Senate as a treaty, so it is non-binding to the current or any future administration. The agreement is largely symbolic and has political leverage against any administration that attempts to exit or alter it. Furthermore, President Biden can evade scrutiny of the judicial and anti-corruption reform aspects of the agreement by not presenting it to the Senate, given his role as vice president in 2019 and his role in the firing of Viktor Shokin over US loan guarantee agreements. The G7 leaders also reached an agreement to support Ukraine by giving it a $50 billion loan. The loan is backed and most likely will be paid back by using the interest from $300 billion of Russian assets that were frozen by the West to punish Russia for invading Ukraine in 2022. The assets generate about $3 billion in interest each year. The EU opposed the US's original plan to seize the entire $300 billion for Ukraine as illegal, leading to a compromise where the interest was used while keeping the principal intact. This could hurt foreign investment, especially from the global south, as ventures can be subject to the political whims of the G7, which is a fact the Russia Foreign Ministry points out. This assumption could be seen as hyperbolic, but the West never seized interest in the frozen Iranian assets dating back to the 1970s, so there is some truth to the criticism. This is new territory for the G7, and Russia, as expected, threatened retaliation but did not elaborate. The G7 members agreed to tighten sanctions against Russia, as well as those entities and countries that assist Russia in avoiding sanctions. The members called on Iran to stop its nuclear weapons ambitions and to stop selling weapons, mainly ballistic missiles, to Russia for use in Ukraine. It threatened significant but unspecified measures against Iran if it sends missiles to Russia. The G7 members also cautioned China against aiding Russia in its war against Ukraine by supplying dual-use equipment and materials that Russia could utilize to boost its defense industry. European leaders see China's support for Russia as a direct threat to European security, necessitating a more direct response to curtail this support. The most likely outcome is more financial sanctions against companies and individuals in China. The G7 is also focusing on and issuing warnings about other methods of circumventing sanctions, such as third-party sales. This occurs when a country attempting to circumvent sanctions sells goods to Central Asian nations such as Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, who then resell these goods to Russia. These former Soviet republics have close economic ties with Russia, but also want to have open markets to the West. Given their history and close proximity to Russia, the imposition of harsh sanctions by the West would inevitably push these countries further into the Russian camp. The leaders focus on sanction loopholes, identified a shadow fleet of ships that aid Russia in circumventing Western sanctions imposed on its oil and gas trade. 31% of the Russian budget comes from oil and gas revenues, so the West is trying to tighten up sanctions on its oil trade without causing an energy price spike. Despite the sanctions, Russian oil revenue continues to increase, which is enabling it to fund its war as its economy and the world market have adjusted the sanctions. The problem is that oil is fungible, and as long as the West wants to avoid an energy shortage or price shock, it either has to convince other oil producers to increase production to compensate for lost Russian oil production, or it has to allow Russian oil to remain on the market and limit its actions to inconveniencing Russian distribution. The West does not want price spikes, and it cannot convince oil producers to produce more oil, especially with strong green lobbies in the West. Russia's ability to sell its oil and finance its war, albeit with some inconveniences to distribution and pricing, has gained acceptance. The G7 is allocating time to invite world leaders from the global south to join in bilateral talks with the G7 leaders. With its emerging economies and the influence of BRICS, which are either non-aligned or aligned with China, Russia and India, in a loose formation that generally opposes a Western-centric global economic system, the global south is becoming increasingly relevant in global economic affairs. The result is that large parts of the world are largely ignoring or refusing to participate in global sanctions against Russia or outright supporting Russia. The G7 leaders are attempting to court countries like India, Brazil and Argentina to help weaken Russia and China by creating a bloc that is closer to those two countries than to the traditional West. This year's G7 meeting had a focused and relatively bold agenda for an organization that finds most of its leaders in weak positions at home. Often domestically challenged leaders will turn to international politics to escape domestic troubles. And this appears to be the case with this current set of leaders who go to Italy to escape their domestic issues. However, the G7 cannot completely escape their political realities, and their weak political positions mean they cannot afford to take any bold action that may cause domestic economic pain for their constituents and negatively impact their electoral popularity. This means that despite bold talk and grandiose statements, the leaders of the G7 are not in a position to take any additional serious action against either Russia for fear of price shocks in the energy market or the loss of Chinese markets and foreign investments. The meeting seemed more of an attempt to keep Ukraine in the war and create incremental pressure to force Russia to quit the war. Instead of offering incentives to attend peace talks, they are using pressure to force Russia to end the war. That part of the saga will play out in Switzerland during a peace conference this weekend.